Man, Wolves fans, this offseason just keeps giving us more and more to think about. And today, we've got two stories that, on the surface, might feel completely different. But when you really look at them together, they raise some pretty serious questions about what this team still needs before the season begins. First, there's a new idea floating around about Minnesota addressing one of the biggest holes left on this roster. And I'm telling you, the player being discussed is interesting. Because he could bring something this team absolutely needs, but the fit is definitely going to spark a debate among Wolves fans. And then the second story might be even more important than basketball fit. Because after everything that changed this offseason, there's a question about this locker room that we really haven't talked about enough. When things get ugly, when the pressure hits, when this team needs somebody to settle everybody down, who's going to be that voice now? So yeah, we've got two big Wolves topics to get into today, and I really want to hear where you guys stand on both of them. But before we get into the first one, if you love talking Wolves basketball every single day, hit that like button and subscribe. I'm Henry, and this channel is still new, so our first goal is getting this community to 100 subscribers. But seriously, only subscribe if you're a real Wolves fan and you actually believe in what this team is building. It'd be pretty special to look back one day and know you were part of this community from the very beginning. Alright, now, let's talk about this first story, because this one could solve a problem Minnesota still hasn't figured out. So, let's start with that first story, because the power forward situation in Minnesota is still one of those things that I keep looking at and thinking, are the Wolves really going into the season like this? And now we have a very interesting name being connected to that need, Jonathan Kuminga. According to Jackson Fetch of The Lead, Minnesota should seriously consider Kuminga as an option at power forward. And when you look at where this roster is right now, I understand why his name is being brought up. Kuminga is still only 23 years old. He was a top 10 pick in the 2021 NBA draft, and he has averaged more than 12 points per game in each of the last 3 seasons. That's important because we're not talking about some veteran at the end of his career who would simply come in, eat up a few minutes, and disappear. There is still upside here. There is still a belief that Kuminga hasn't completely reached his ceiling. And last season gave us another look at both sides of the Jonathan Kuminga experience. During the 2025-2026 regular season, after moving from the Golden State Warriors to the Atlanta Hawks in the middle of the season, Kuminga averaged 12.3 points, 5.3 rebounds, and 2.1 assists over 16 regular season games with Atlanta. And immediately, you saw the explosiveness. He scored 27 points in his Hawks debut. That's the part of Kuminga that gets people excited. The athleticism, the ability to attack, the physical tools, the moments where you watch him and think, man, if somebody can put all of this together consistently, there is a really good NBA player in there. But we also have to be fair about the other side. There was inconsistency, and there were injury issues down the stretch. Then Atlanta reached the playoffs, and Kuminga averaged 13.7 points, 3.3 rebounds, and 1 assist over 6 games, as the Hawks were eliminated in the first round by the eventual NBA champion New York Knicks. So why are we even talking about him in Minnesota? Because this Wolves roster has changed dramatically. The biggest issue is what happened at power forward after Minnesota moved both Julius Randle and Nez Reid. Randle was traded to the Brooklyn Nets in exchange for a second-round pick, and then Minnesota made that massive deal with the Charlotte Hornets. With Charlotte sending LaMelo Ball and Josh Green to the Timberwolves in exchange for Naz Reid, a huge package of draft assets, and additional draft rights. And listen, LaMelo Ball obviously changes the way we think about this Wolves offense. You're adding another incredibly talented creator alongside Anthony Edwards. You have someone who can handle the ball, create opportunities, push the pace, and give this offense another dimension. But there was a cost. Nez Reid is gone, Julius Randle is gone. And suddenly, you look at power forward and say, okay, who exactly owns that position now? That's why Kuminga is interesting. Jackson Fetch made the argument that Kuminga's size and athleticism could work well, alongside LaMelo Ball. But there's another part of his analysis that I think matters even more. Minnesota already has offensive options. You've got Anthony Edwards, you've got Jaden McDaniels, you've got Ayo Dosunmu, you've got LaMelo Ball, you've got Terrence Shannon Jr. So if Kuminga came to Minnesota, this probably wouldn't be about telling him that we need him taking 20 shots every night. Quite the opposite. The Wolves could ask him to put more of his energy into defense and rebounding. And that's where I start getting really interested. Because if Jonathan Kuminga accepts that responsibility, uses that athleticism defensively, attacks the glass, runs the floor, and takes advantage of the scoring opportunities created by guys like Anthony Edwards and LaMelo Ball, I can see the vision, but there's a difference between seeing the vision and knowing it would work. Because we've been waiting for Kuminga to fully put everything together for a while now. There have been flashes. There has been real production. There have also been stretches where you want more consistency. And Minnesota cannot make this decision just because the name sounds exciting. The Wolves need somebody who actually fits what Chris Finch wants from that position. And Finch himself has basically confirmed that this question is still open. Speaking with Chris Hine of the Minnesota Star-Tribune, Chris Finch made it clear that he does not simply expect Jaden McDaniels to slide over and become the full-time power forward. Finch said he can see McDaniels playing the 4 at times, maybe even for a good number of minutes, but he does not immediately envision Jaden simply moving over permanently. And importantly, Finch said he doesn't necessarily picture the starting lineup with McDaniels at the 4. That tells you something. The coaching staff knows this roster still needs an answer. And Finch also talked about how Minnesota has approached that position depending on matchups in the past. Some nights you need a shooting 4. Other nights you need a more physical, rugged 4. Sometimes you need somebody who can attack. He referenced how the Wolves eventually developed a comfort level around what Karl-Anthony Towns needed to do in those situations. And Finch also emphasized that there are always tactical choices and trade-offs when you're building a game plan. That versatility matters. Because in the Western Conference, you're going to see completely different challenges depending on who's standing across from you. Right now, Trey Lyles is the primary natural veteran power forward on this roster. Minnesota also has smaller or more unconventional options. Jaden McDaniels can obviously play some minutes there. Ayo Dosunmu can give them different looks. Terrence Shannon Jr. can potentially provide more scoring punch depending on what Finch wants from a particular lineup. But none of that changes the bigger question. Do the Wolves still need another legitimate power forward? Because Chris Finch's comments certainly make it sound like Minnesota hasn't completely settled this, and that's why Jonathan Kuminga's name is going to get attention. Personally, I understand the appeal. 23 years old, athletic, strong, can score, has playoff experience, still has room to grow. Put that kind of athlete around Anthony Edwards and LaMelo Ball, with Jaden McDaniels out there as well, and you could have some ridiculously athletic lineups. But I would need one thing from Kuminga. If he comes in thinking this has to be his offense, I'm not convinced. If he comes in saying that he's going to defend, rebound, run, attack, mismatches, and let the game come to him, then now we're talking. Because Minnesota doesn't necessarily need another player fighting Anthony Edwards and LaMelo Ball for offensive control. They need someone who makes everything around those guys work better. And while Wolves fans are debating whether Jonathan Kuminga could be that guy, the second story raises a completely different question. This one isn't about who starts at power forward. It's about who leads this team when things start going wrong. Because Minnesota has lost some major veteran voices. Mike Conley is no longer there. Kyle Anderson is gone. Joe Ingles is gone. And those losses might not show up immediately when you look at points, rebounds, assists, or shooting percentages. But locker rooms aren't built on box scores alone. That's what Leo's son of Canis Hoopus raised when discussing whether the Wolves need more veteran leadership. The team has been spending time together in France during the offseason, and seeing players bond is obviously encouraging. Somebody is going to emerge and take responsibility within this group. But what happens once the real pressure begins? That's the question. Who breaks the huddle without Mike Conley? Who becomes that calming veteran presence when Anthony Edwards is frustrated? When LaMelo Ball is frustrated? When the Wolves have just blown a lead? Or when they've lost 3 games in a row and everybody outside that locker room starts panicking? And yeah, there's a funny side to this too. Who replaces Joe Ingles as that veteran personality throwing jokes around? Who gives Rudy Gobert that Kyle Anderson type of veteran interaction and edge? Those personalities matter over an 82-game season. And Mike Conley, especially, represented something that is extremely difficult to replace. Experience.com, professionalism. The ability to understand the moment. You can have all the talent in the world, but playoff basketball gets chaotic. You need people who have been through it. Think about this Wolves team now. Anthony Edwards is clearly becoming the face and emotional heartbeat of this franchise. He has to continue growing as a leader. Jaden McDaniels has been through playoff battles. Rudy Gobert has a ton of NBA experience. LaMelo Ball brings another major personality and another star-level talent into the locker room. But leadership isn't just about being your best player. Sometimes the most important veteran on a team is the guy who barely plays. The guy who sees something going wrong and pulls a young player aside. The guy who tells everybody after a brutal loss that they're fine and they need to get back to work tomorrow. The guy who can challenge your superstar without creating drama. And that brings us to an interesting roster decision. Minnesota reportedly still has a couple of open roster spots. So what do you do with them? Do you prioritize basketball depth? Maybe another power forward. Maybe another player who can help the rotation immediately. Or do you use one of those spots on an experienced veteran who might not play every night but gives Chris Finch another trusted voice inside that locker room? That is a much harder decision than people realize. Because everybody loves young talent until April and May arrive. Then suddenly, every possession matters. One bad decision can swing a playoff game. One ugly stretch can change an entire series. And when you're trying to win a championship, you cannot underestimate people who have already lived through those moments. And I think these two stories actually connect more than it initially seems. Minnesota has undergone major change. Julius Randle is gone, Nez Reid is gone, Mike Conley is gone, Kyle Anderson is gone, Joe Ingles is gone, LaMelo Ball and Josh Green are now part of this team. And Chris Finch is still figuring out exactly what his frontcourt is going to look like. That is a lot of change for a team with championship expectations. The talent is absolutely there. Anthony Edwards is still the centerpiece. You now have LaMelo Ball adding creativity and playmaking. Jaden McDaniels remains a major part of the identity of this team. Rudy Gobert still gives you that defensive presence. Ayo Dosunmu and Terrence Shannon Jr. give Finch more options. Trey Lyles gives Minnesota an actual veteran power forward. And then you potentially have a player like Jonathan Kuminga becoming part of the conversation. But talent alone isn't the question anymore. The question is balance. Can Minnesota find the right power forward without disrupting what already works? Can they replace some of the toughness and production they lost when Julius Randle and Nez Reid were moved? Can they replace the leadership that disappeared with Mike Conley, Kyle Anderson, and Joe Ingles? And most importantly, can all these new pieces come together quickly enough to compete for a championship? Because that has to be the standard now. We're past the point where simply making the playoffs feels good enough. When you have Anthony Edwards entering another season with this kind of talent around him, expectations change. Wolves fans want playoff runs. They want this team competing deep into May and June. They want to believe Minnesota can actually finish the job. And that's why these remaining roster decisions matter so much. Jonathan Kuminga could potentially address the power forward question, but only if the fit, role, and expectations make sense. And even if Minnesota solves that problem, I still wouldn't ignore the leadership question. Sometimes the move that changes a season isn't the flashy one. Sometimes it's the veteran sitting near the end of the bench who keeps everybody together when the season gets uncomfortable. So now I really want to know what you guys think. Would you want Jonathan Kuminga in Minnesota? Do you believe his athleticism, defense, rebounding potential, and scoring ability would make him the right power forward next to Anthony Edwards, LaMelo Ball, Jaden McDaniels, and Rudy Gobert? And for that second question, do you think this Wolves locker room already has enough leadership, or should Minnesota use one of those remaining roster spots to bring in another experienced veteran? Drop your opinion in the comments because I genuinely want to see where Wolves fans stand on both of these. And if you enjoyed talking Wolves basketball with me, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We're still building this thing from the ground up, and our first target is 100 subscribers. But like I said earlier, only subscribe if you really believe in the future of this team and you want to be part of this Wolves community from the beginning. Because this roster has changed, the expectations are massive, and there are still questions that need answers. But if Minnesota gets these final decisions right, man, this season could be special.